Skyrim and I are old friends. It was one of, if not my very first video game of any substance, at least when I could actually comprehend what I was doing. From the plains of Whiterun to the forest of Falkreath and the Rift, the mountains of the Reach and Hoffingar, and the frozen Stormcloak-infested hellscape of literally every other part of this Talos-forsaken country. Important use of words there. Despite the name of the video, I'm actually not an Imperial fan. 9 divines out of 10, I'm joining the Stormcloaks. Whether that's because I have a distinctive hatred for anything even loosely associated with the Thalmor, because the current Cyrodiilic Empire is a heaving, gasping corpse that needs to die already so something new can be born, because I have Scandinavian heritage and some part of me longs for the ice and snow of the north, or just because Ulfric is an actual character while General Tullius is a walking, talking recruitment poster. Who can say? Regardless of why I'd side with them, you'll usually find me kicking Imperial dogs down and teaming up with my fellow sons and daughters of Skyrim for some good old-fashioned Nordic fun. But does that mean as a faction I think they're actually capable of maintaining Skyrim in the long term? Well, let me be pedantic and answer that question with another question. Can you feed an army on snow and dreams? Come along, friends, as I explain exactly why the Stormcloaks are not winning this. Besides my previous pedantic statement, there's a number of reasons to think the Stormcloaks' new regime would collapse within years without direct help of the Dragonborn. In fact, I'd argue the Stormcloaks have more of a chance of killing Lord Harkin or Alduin themselves than actually beating the Empire. The Stormcloaks are settled in the eastern half of the country, centered around Windhelm and Ulfric's base of power. Windhelm and its hold, Eastmarch, is 1 part ice and 1 part volcanic geyser field. Besides lumber and the occasional farm, Eastmarch alone isn't providing much in the way of raw materials for the war effort. The Pale has ore and used to have trade from the north, but good luck getting any of that done with the Empire having the only navy out of the two. Not to mention Vermina screwing with the populace. The Rift is a big breadbasket, the largest in Skyrim in fact, and having that providing for the Stormcloaks is a massive boon. But the Rift is also beset by poor management, corruption, poverty, and the only thing in all of creation worse than Maroon's Dagon or more like Ball, Maven Blackbriar, who has the city so deep in her pockets that it might as well be her own little plane of oblivion. And of course Winterhold is about as useful as Morthal, but at least Morthal has something of a population to back up the local Imperial conscripts. And they are conscripts, if any of you didn't realize that. The actual Imperial legions aren't really in Skyrim. There's some of them, to be sure, but not enough to fight this civil war. The lore reasons for that is that the passes between Skyrim and Cyrodiil that are the primary way to enter the country are blocked up by avalanches and snow from the winter. And because the Empire is busy diverting troops elsewhere in preparations for the Second Great War that is no doubt coming. The Aldmeri Dominion called the Great War the First War with the Empire, so you'd better believe a second one is coming. Ulfric knows this, Tullius knows this, Titus Mead knows this, everyone with half a brain knows this. I've heard arguments that Ulfric is just a tool for the Thalmor, and while you can make arguments that many of his actions directly benefit the Altmer, I don't think he's 100% helpful to them. The Thalmor dossiers found in the MC explicitly state they want this war to go on as long as possible, while Ulfric wants it done and over with as soon as possible. Not to mention that there's nothing preventing a new independent Skyrim from allying with the Empire when the next Great War comes along. So it's beneficial to the Thalmor to keep this war going so tension and grudges last longer as well. Yet another thing Ulfric is trying to prevent. That's because he's probably very aware of how tenuous their position is. The moment those southern passes clear up, the Imperials could swarm the province in a matter of months, and no amount of fiery speeches about the Thalmor would stop that. The Imperials and Thalmor employ battle mages that cave their skulls in with magic ice spikes or cook them in their own armor, while the Stormcloaks, common Nords that they are, fear magic like the plague. They barely tolerate the College of Winterhold, and that's probably because they're afraid it could blow up what's left of the city. And to be fair, it probably could. I wouldn't put it past them, the whole place is filled with lunatics and morons with inferiority complexes. Added to the fact that the Thalmor are technically on the side of the Imperials with this one, and their information network put anything the Stormcloaks could pretend to have to shame. That said, it's not like the Stormcloaks are in a completely doomed ship, just one headed for an iceberg. There are some factors that could steer them away from that, the big one being, well, you, the Dragonborn. Surprise, surprise, having an avatar of Akatosh, Dragon God of Time, and possibly an aspect of Lorcan who can rewrite the laws of physics by yelling loud enough on your side is a pretty big win condition in a war of attrition. Who needs siege engines when you can ask the Dragonborn to just drop a mountain of cheese for your boys to crawl over? Want someone dead? No worries, the Dragonborn is already the Thane of every hold in Skyrim, he can do whatever he wants. Want a way to rally even more angry Talos worshippers to your side? What better than an actual Dragonborn, just like Tiber Septim was? But I'm not talking about the obvious reasons. Anyone could take Skyrim over with a literal soul-devouring demigod on their side. The Khajiit could if they tried hard enough. Ulfric actually has a couple other ways to steer his ship towards victory, although they're more unlikely, and at least one of them is a little bit based off of what can only be described as vibes. The first thing is their favor in something more historically relevant, and I mean real-world history, not Elder Scrolls history. Well, maybe that one too, I don't know. Guerrilla warfare has historically been exceptionally effective when a larger, more conveniently powerful force is trying to conquer a region they have little experience in and have difficulty accessing. Americans saw it in Vietnam, and we saw it way back in the Revolutionary War when we were the ones doing it. I don't care how many magic missiles your mage is firing, if you're trying to fight an enemy that knows the lands better than you do, you might as well pray to whichever of the 9 divines you still actually believe in that said enemies don't have booby traps in every last inch of ground between you and them. The next thing is fairly obvious. Whiterun. Take Whiterun and you basically have the run of all Skyrim. We see that in-game with whatever side you pick. Whiterun has large open fields with plenty of viable farmland and positions to attack the neighboring holds. Falkreath is pretty much already captured if the Stormcloaks manage to take Whiterun, and that offers even more lumber and raw resources for the war machine, and would almost guarantee a Stormcloak win. Naturally, the question of how they'd capture Whiterun is also important. Balgriff, cool guy he may be, is not going to side with Ulfric, so the act of taking Whiterun will be a bloody one. However, the Stormcloaks are more than capable of doing so if the Empire isn't involved. Noticed how I said if the Empire isn't involved. Hold on to that, I'll get to it in a moment. It doesn't hurt that Ulfric's no idiot. He knows this war won't be won on dreams alone. He actively says that without Whiterun, the rebellion isn't going to be doing much besides being an annoyance to the Empire, which is why it takes him so long to actually start the war properly. By the time of Skyrim's start, Ulfric hadn't really started the Stormcloaks' war effort in earnest, as he was holding out for as many of his fellow Jarls to join his side as possible. And by fellow Jarls, I mean Balgriff specifically. Balgriff is a character that deserves his own video, but suffice to say that Ulfric had respect for the man, especially since he stood his ground when it came to not choosing a side. But that particular stance wasn't very advantageous to Ulfric, and he was the one on a time limit. So he sends his axe to Balgriff, and the Civil War of Skyrim gets real toasty. What happens from there is subject to the player's interference, but no matter what, Balgriff will side with the Empire. By siding with the Empire, Balgriff throws Ulfric's whole plan into jeopardy. If you've been paying attention, you know why Ulfric needs Whiterun, but it's that same reason that the Empire also needs Whiterun. By joining the Imperials, Balgriff basically opened the door to the Stormcloak Rebellion and Windhelm itself, leaving Ulfric no choice but to attack immediately. The Battle of Whiterun is the most important moment in the Civil War, because whoever wins that battle wins Skyrim itself. The battles of Solitude and Windhelm for either side really amount to just putting a thrashing animal down. Whiterun is the real deciding factor. And let's not pretend the whole of Whiterun is united. Even in the city itself, you'll find a solid 2/3 are more pro-Stormcloak than Imperial, including Yorlin Greymane, the smith of the Companion's Skyforge. Push comes to shove, you better believe that the Greymane's connections are going to be a thorn in any Imperial attempt to keep the hold. In fact, Riverwood, the hold's source of lumber, is basically run by Stormcloaks already, with Gerdur and her family. A former Blade runs the inn, and even the blacksmith who has family in the Imperial Legion isn't lifting a finger to help anyone if the old blues come a-marching in. I firmly believe that if Ulfric really wanted, he could have attacked Whiterun whenever he wanted, and from there he'd be poised to cut the Empire's presence in Skyrim at the knees. Whether because he can now attack almost every Imperial-leaning hold from Whiterun, he has the Skyforge churning out borderline magical weapons for his army, or simply because Whiterun's resources could reinvigorate the rebellion tenfold. Taking and holding Whiterun would go a long way to debilitating the Empire. But that'd require him not demanding Balgriff pick a side and giving him the chance to run to the Empire. Needless to say, if it was just Whiterun alone, the Stormcloaks win no question, but with the Imperial forces backing them up, Whiterun becomes the gamble of all gambles, at least from Ulfric's point of view. And judging by the title of the video, you can guess what I think would be the outcome of that, or at least the most likely one. It wouldn't be impossible, and if Ulfric planned it right and had enough defectors from Whiterun itself, he could pull it off. I mean, look at the Greymanes. But those are some rather hefty win conditions, and even if he did pull it off, the Stormcloaks would be absolutely wrecked. The Imperials wouldn't fare much better, but they're the ones in the defensive positions in the Battle of Whiterun, so it would take far less casualties on their side to secure a victory. Even a draw amounts to a win when you're on the defense. Now, to further explain the final point, we need to actually cover everything that led up to the rebellion's start, and where we are at the beginning of the game, which really starts about 15 years before the events of Skyrim during the Markarth incident. During the Great War in the year 174 of the Fourth Era, the Forsworn took the opportunity left by the sudden recall of Imperial legions to Cyrodiil as the Empire was busy putting up the best fight it could, which required all the help they could get, particularly from Skyrim. Because of this, the Forsworn's uprising began and was successful practically overnight, with the at the time Jarl of Markarth, Hrolfdir, and his son Igmund being run out of the city. Meanwhile, Ulfric's Stormcloak, fresh from the Great War, being imprisoned and no doubt tortured by the Thalmor, was probably itching to work off some steam. During his imprisonment by the Thalmor, Ulfric was gaslit into believing that info that he spilled directly led to the capture of the Imperial city, despite the fact that the city had already fallen by the time this had happened. In case you needed further proof that Thalmor as a faction are somehow less redeemable than the Dark Brotherhood. With all that pent-up anger, when the Jarl of Markarth reached out and asked Ulfric to help him take back the city and promised free Talos worship as a bonus, Ulfric was raring to go. And boy did he go, retaking Markarth and the Reach almost instantly. Afterwards, he reinstated Jarl Hrolfdir and called it a day. From there, accounts vary, but from what can be gathered, Jarl Hrolfdir went to town seeking out every last Forsworn that hadn't been scattered to the hills by Ulfric's initial attack, and anyone that worked or vouched for them were either imprisoned or executed, and by some Forsworn accounts this included women and children. And while we have no reason to disbelieve some of these claims, none of them suggest Ulfric was the one responsible. Now, before any of you Forsworn apologists try yapping at me in the comments, trying to tell me that the Bear of Markarth clearly states that the Forsworn ran a peaceful kingdom before Ulfric walked up and murdered them before declaring himself King of Markarth, while these saintly Imperials wanted to make peace with them and Ulfric, I'll remind you that the same guy who wrote that also wrote Mad Men of the Reach, in which the obviously Imperial author tries to paint the Hagraven-worshipping, heart-replacing, civilian-slaughtering bunch of savages as misunderstood rebels that just wanted freedom. Both of these books are propaganda to make you think Ulfric bad and Forsworn/Imperials good, and you fell right into it, you fools. Shortly after Hrolfdir and Ulfric had sorted this whole mess out, the Imperial Legion arrived to finally restore order, only to find their job already done, with Ulfric demanding they recognize Markarth's right to freely worship Talos. To which the Empire said, "Alright, sure." See, at this point the Empire was only superficially enforcing the ban on Talos worship and just hoped the Dominion wouldn't find out. They found out. And when given the option, they chose to scapegoat Ulfric to prevent another war so soon after the first one. Call it cowardly if you want, but I can't really blame the Empire for going with this route. They barely survived the First Great War while also losing Hammerfell. They were in no position to stand up to the elves, and so they got Hrolfdir to betray Ulfric and his militia and have the whole of them captured, not realizing they just ensured the Stormcloak Rebellion's existence. After all that nonsense, Ulfric then suffered a personal tragedy as his father, Jarl Hogue, died while his son was in prison, and Ulfric had to smuggle out a eulogy for his father via letter. As you can imagine, when he arrived back in Windhelm to the people mourning Hogue's death, and spiteful at the old Merry Dominion, Ulfric's tolerance for the Empire and the elves had finally snapped, and he began talking about independence even in front of High King Torygg. Torygg himself was a complicated person. There's even a bit to suggest mutual respect between Ulfric and Torygg. You could make the argument that Torygg would have done as he asked if Ulfric had actually asked, as well as evidence to suggest Torygg was a Talos worshipper. But that's not really important, as Torygg was never going to secede from the Empire like Ulfric wanted, either because he believed Skyrim couldn't fight the elves alone, or because he didn't want to rip apart the Empire Tiber Septim built, or he was just a coward. Regardless of the reasoning behind both men, the facts remain the same. In the year 201 of the Fourth Era, Ulfric challenged High King Torygg to a traditional Nordic duel, which he was honor-bound to accept, despite knowing he was going to die. Credit where credit is due, Torygg didn't flinch. He took Ulfric head-on as best he could, even showing up in Sovngarde, meaning that at the very least the gods saw him as dying in battle and doing so honorably. And before anyone tries to say that him showing up in Sovngarde proves he was a good person and Ulfric murdered him unfairly, just remember that Ulfric also goes to Sovngarde if you kill him, so get back to me on that one. The Empire accused him of murder and treason, and Ulfric fled the city. He was led out by a sympathizer, and from then on, the Skyrim Civil War was well on its way. Why did I go on this history lesson? Because the second biggest point in the Stormcloaks' favor behind an actual demigod showing up to help is that Ulfric probably has the relative popularity in Skyrim compared to the Imperials. You might not believe that. You might say that he's only popular among stupid racist Nords who don't know better, and you'd be right and wrong at the same time. Sure, folks love Elisif, but most couldn't care less about Tullius and whoever would replace him should the worst happen. Ulfric, on the other hand, is irreplaceable. The entire faction is named after him. Ulfric is a war hero who fought and freed Markarth from the Forsworn after the Imperials all but abandoned them. To be fair, the Empire was busy getting their teeth kicked in by the Thalmor who had just rolled up to the Imperial city, but good luck telling that to the people who just saw actual witch worshippers kick down the door and take over. All of this is context that should tell you why so many people in Skyrim side with Ulfric. As far as they're concerned, what happened to him is just the prime example of how the Empire and the Dominion would treat all of them in the same scenario. Combined with the outlawing of basically Nordic Jesus, Hammerfell proving that you can in fact be independent from the Empire and kick the Thalmor out of your country, and the many Nord lives lost during the Great War while the Dominion never even set foot in the province, and you have a recipe for a revolt. While I believe the Empire is more understandable than my fellow Stormcloaks may think, Hammerfell and Blackmarsh were clear indicators, at least to the Nords, that the Empire may need the provinces, but the provinces definitely don't need the Empire. And there was Ulfric, who had been at the forefront telling the Empire where they could shove the white gold Concordat, and saying that the people of Skyrim didn't need the Empire anymore. With all that behind him, it's no real surprise that everywhere you go in Skyrim there's at least one person solidly in Ulfric's camp. Falkreath would probably be in its own mini-civil war between the two Jarls if it wasn't for it literally bordering Cyrodiil and having barely any people in the hold. Whether genuine or not, Ulfric standing up for the worship of Talos and the right and culture of the Skyrim earns him friends just about everywhere, even if those friends aren't immediately in charge. The Empire has a few of those too, but evidently not enough if they're putting people like Maven Blackbriar in charge. Corruption doesn't begin to describe that woman, and whoever's bank account she filled for that position deserves to be left on the border of the Aldmeri Dominion with their legs bound and a sign that says Khajiit are the best elves. The grander point is that Ulfric and the Stormcloaks have a lot of smaller advantages that keep them going, and if the stars align and Talos, or more likely Lorkhan, is on their side, then they could knock down the dominoes just right to bleed the Empire and Skyrim dry. But, short of Dragonborn intervention, that's a big if. The Empire, at least the part that's present in Skyrim, by default has the better resources, overall training, the better location, and more importantly, time. In a war of attrition, the one with time on their side is going to, more likely than not, leave the other side gasping. The Empire still has Cyrodiil and High Rock to the south and west, and while Bretons might not seem like the first thing you think of when I say dangerous, they are still more magically gifted than either Imperials or Nords. The Empire has Morrowind too, I guess, but they're a little busy with the whole nuclear winter thing. Still, Imperial troops can pass through and around that. Cyrodiil's climate and general geography is also far more fruitful when it comes to agriculture, which gives them food, which feeds an army of battle-hardened legionnaires who are also itching from the Great War that half the Stormcloaks fought in. The ones in Skyrim may be conscripts, and it may be a hard process to get troops in mass, but the Empire can afford to wait a bit longer than the Stormcloaks can. There's also a leadership advantage. With the Empire's forces, even a loss of direct leadership wouldn't mean an end to the Imperial resistance. Tullius' loss would be grave and damaging, and you can even kill the Emperor of all things during the game, but the Empire and its armies will keep moving forward, because the military structures in place will fill the gaps necessary, and the governmental structures in the Imperial city can run the military without an Emperor. Arguably, they'd be able to do it better without a central figure who could be a liability in the wrong circumstances. The Stormcloaks don't have that luxury. If Ulfric dies, that's the end of it. That's why Tullius likely wanted to end things as soon as possible in Helgen, ensuring that the rebellion died. Because if the Stormcloak part of the rebellion is gone, then the Empire has free reign to resettle the country. That is, if the Empire actually played their cards right, which they don't, but that's a whole other matter. In summation, the Stormcloak Rebellion is stuck in a war of attrition that has just enough ways to win that it would more than likely lead to a longer, more agonizing war for the entire province. However, luckily for them, the Dragonborn exists and is able to wrap up said war in record time. I mean, unless of course you choose Imperial, you mongrel dog of the Empire. But that will be all from me, your friendly neighborhood soldier in blue, fighting for the right to worship our God Emperor against those filthy elves. Wait a minute. I have been the Hearth Guy, and it's been a pleasure to dive into a game world that's been so integral to my own developing ideas of storytelling, characters, and the kinds of stories you can tell with video games as a whole. A massive shout out to my patrons, who generously fund my intrusive thoughts and encourage me to keep making videos I want to make. You're all truly wonderful. If you want to support me in this channel, consider liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing the video around. Becoming a patron or a YouTube member earns you early access to content, access to a private Discord server where you can hang out in a cozy corner of the internet, and ways to directly interact with me on a regular basis. It's optional, however, and you shouldn't feel pressured to give any more than you're willing to or able. Thank you all for watching, and remember to support your Stormcloaks in the fight against the Empire. And I will see you all next time, around the hearth. If I had a nickel for every time I played a game where a blue-toned Northern Kingdom of honor-loving traditionalists went to war over a religious issue against an overextending red-themed empire while a yellow-themed faction watched on from the distance, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Wait, didn't I already make this joke for triangle strategy? It's not exactly the same, but hold on. Kingdom of honor-loving traditionalists, religious war. Wow. Crazy how that works. Only 2 red-themed empires, though. Unlike that other red empire, though, this one has the life expectancy of a fly on cocaine.